Hello, listeners. It's Susan. And today I want you to get out a pen and paper because there are so many golden nuggets in today's episode with my special guest, Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick, that I want you to be able to take down each and every one as we go through the episode. Dr. Liz is a licensed professional counselor and she owns 2 group private practices in Arizona. She's got her doctoral degree in psychology as well as a master's degree in professional counseling. And we are going to dive into something that she calls relational programming. This is therapeutic work that she does, and it really goes back into your, relationships and your attachment styles, but also how it's impacting your adult relationships and how it might impact your divorce and your life after divorce. So we're going to talk about how your relational programming and perhaps deprogramming can help you navigate a healthy breakup. So I invite you now to listen in as I chat with Dr. Liz. So Dr. Liz, thank you so much for joining me today. I am looking forward to diving into this idea of relational programming and maybe a little deprogramming. So first, just thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here to chat with you.
Well, and as I mentioned to my listeners in the intro, I found you on Instagram. They know that I spend far too much time on Instagram, but honestly, social media is a place where we can get information across. We really, it's a way that people can get those little, I think you called them nuggets. I have another friend who calls them t-shirt slogans, but you can get, little nuggets of gold. Yeah, I call them the golden nuggets as well.
Yes.
Of information across to people. And, you put out this fantastic content, those great nuggets of information. You also have a sense of humor, which is really what drew me in. I love a girl with a sense of humor. But one of the things that I really love that you talk about is this, the therapeutic work that you do. You work with a lot of people who are in the throes of relationship issues, which, obviously my listeners are. So let's just talk a little bit about your therapeutic work and who you do work with and what you do.
Sure. Yes. So I specialize in relationship work and attachment work. And so not to be confused with only doing couples work. So I do a lot of this in the individual context as well. So where somebody is maybe coming in and often coming in because they're struggling with anxiety or depression, symptoms of that, and don't even realize the direct connection and this correlation it has to the relationships in their life, whether romantic or family members or friends. But often these symptoms are coming from dysfunction in those areas. And so I focus a lot of my work on relational programming, which we'll get into, but how their behaviors in relationship developed. And then how it's influencing them currently. And so I do couples work as well. So I do relationship work and individual, but that is what I specialize in, is how does one's attachment, how does the functioning of their relationships influence their current daily functioning and mood states.
Right. And when you say, these days it really feels like we're seeing so many people with depression, anxiety. There's been a real upsurge in that, yeah. And it's definitely taking a toll on relationships. But I find it interesting what you're saying is that the relationships are also taking a toll on our mental health.
Yes, absolutely. It is all intertwined. And it's so fascinating when you talk about this increase in the symptoms of anxiety and depression. No doubt we've seen this huge increase since the pandemic, right? And what has been so interesting is that the quality of a lot of people's relationships has really come to surface during this time, because whether they're isolated, they're stuck together, or maybe not getting enough time together, whatever that is, how the pandemic has shifted the dynamic of the relationship, it has really brought a lot of insights to people about their relational programming.
Yeah, well, and I think that's, I get asked a lot as a divorce attorney, has the pandemic made divorce go up, or are there more divorces because of it? And honestly, and maybe you have an opinion on this, I think I've seen, yes, certainly relationships that were already struggling struggle more. under all of the conditions of COVID. But I've also seen the adversity be something that brings people together. So something that people are have managed to take all the difficulties of pandemic and the challenges, and it's made their bond stronger.
Absolutely. And I've seen both. And I think that this ties into how people relate. And so if somebody has an avoidant attachment style, or if somebody is feels trapped easily, if all of those things that already exist in a regular dynamic and now they're stuck together all day, every day, that really created quite a shift. But I think the other interesting point of that is that with that isolation, like I even talked to couples about maybe they go to start a business together, or they both start working from home, or there's a lot of things that put them in the same space all the time that I've seen the same outcome from. So I don't know, as a divorce attorney, I'm sure that you have also seen that influence, but I caution couples, because when they talk about maybe starting a business together or deciding to work from home together, I caution them that there is such thing as too much time together.
It makes me think of, I called it retirement woes. I
Yes.
have had more cases than, really sort of, one of the reasons why I think gray divorce is actually on the rise, because people who had careers or went off and were not together all day, I have seen over and over again in a relatively short period of time that when one or both retire and they're both at home all day, suddenly that's not an ideal situation for the two of them.
Absolutely, because when we talk about the term interdependence, and so this idea of, we talk a lot about codependency, and being hyper independent, but the idea of interdependence, where you are you and I am me, and together we get to be a we. And so that means that we have our own lives, and we have something to talk about at the end of the day, right? Like something that you don't know about me. And when you're together all day, every day, there's no longer a separate you and me. We just become a blurred we, which is very damaging for the novelty of the relationship, for desire, but also just for boundaries. So there's a lot of things that influences.
I never thought of it that way. It totally takes away the conversation of, so honey, how was your day at the dinner table? That's for sure.
Right. Absolutely.
So I was mentioning to you as we were getting ready to tape the podcast that, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is relational programming. And, if I think about that, I think of all different kinds of, for some reason it brings to mind cults and, and programming or all. But what do you mean by relational programming?
You know what, though? That's spot on, because really what relational programming is that we've been exposed to something and influenced by something over and over and over, and being so vulnerable and so malleable to just absorb that, right? And so when I'm talking about relational programming, this starts in childhood. This starts really in infancy. And what takes place is these early interactions with our caregivers sets the stage for how we view relationships, how we view ourselves, how we view the world as a whole. And so what I mean by this is, if you're raised by a caregiver who is warm and nurturing and attentive, versus a caregiver who is maybe neglectful or aggressive or abusive, this is going to set the stage for how we view ourselves, right? Because if I have a need and somebody's responsive to that, the core belief that is developed is that I am worthy, that I matter, that somebody loves and cares about me. Whereas if I have a need and I express that and it's met with, be quiet, shut up, or something even violent, I am now learning I'm not important, I'm a burden, and I don't matter. And so when that belief and obviously these are two extremes of parenting, right? Then there's what I talk to my clients about a lot is there's a lot of covert ways that those negative messages are sent. And so maybe that is just, maybe the parent is present in the home, but they don't know how to be emotionally present. That's going to ultimately send the same message. And so this foundation of programming is then reaffirmed throughout the lifespan and what we carry with us into adulthood.
So it so strikes me about that is that, because I see this all the time. And again, as a divorce attorney for a very long time, I've actually had clients who who I've represented in more than one divorce, right? They've gotten divorced, they go and remarry, and then that relationship also does not work out. And I've had that happen several times. And I've seen a pattern in their spouses that they're very similar personality types that they're drawn to and that they marry. And I'm wondering if this might be something that stems from what they experienced in their early years from a caregiver.
And that's absolutely right, because the programming, and I describe it as programming a computer. And so where you plug in the wires, or where I don't know how to program a computer, but I would imagine you plug stuff in and whatever you do with it, right? And that is then how that computer operates. It's based on what was plugged into it, what parts were put in. And so, yes, that is how the computer is now. It doesn't know any better. That's just how it operates, is the way that it was programmed. And so to your point, when we're programmed in a certain way to believe that this is just the way people are. And so if our parents were maybe emotionally neglectful, or they were unsafe or chaotic, we just believe this is how we don't know any better. This is what relationships are. And so the brain is designed to seek out what is familiar. And so we continue to do that into adulthood. And so we crave what is familiar. And what's really interesting is when people talk about like butterflies or chemistry, those sparks, that is often what we would describe a trauma response. And so the body is actually responding to, oh, I know this is familiar, I want more of it. Whether it's toxic or otherwise, the brain just knows it's familiar. And so that's what it seeks out.
Oh my gosh. So that's like your butterflies could actually be a butterfly with a red flag.
Absolutely. And that is and I try to caution people to be aware of that, because there are some mental health professionals who they just caution fully against, if you get the butterflies, like, you should be concerned. And I don't agree, because I do think that butterflies, and I do believe the chemistry can exist in a healthy way. But when it gets obsessive, or when there are red flags, or there are cautionary behaviors, and you still are like, oh, I want it, that's when we're kind of checking in on, okay, is this a trauma response, or is this healthy chemistry?
That's a good point. I have this vision in my mind of a butterfly running around, like waving this big red flag.
You have to create that image.
I was just going to say, be watching the Instagram feed,
Yes.
folks. I suspect you will see it. And so I can see this. And if you grew up in a perfect household with every possible, attachment, parents who supported every single thing, maybe that would then carry you forward into a lifetime of fantastic, perfect adult relationships. I suspect I don't know, you don't know anyone. I know I don't know anyone who has perfect relationships. But so if you're in a relationship and that butterfly had the red flags, but you're in it, would it cause you to stay in that relationship for longer because you think this is what's normal?
Yes, and that's exactly right. Because if you don't know any different, the idea is just, well, this is just the way it is. This is just the way relationships are. So I just have to make it work. And so you're going to stay stuck in it because you might not know any different. You might stay stuck in it because of your own dysfunctional behaviors, which I caution people to look at all the time, right? All the stuff that, I shouldn't say all, a lot of the stuff that gets posted on social media is about directing that towards how this is happening to you. The narcissist in your life, the abusive people in your life, the toxic actions that are happening towards you. But to your earlier point, none of us are perfect, and we all have our own toxic, unhealthy behaviors. And so also, the relational programming makes us not know really any different. And so, we stay stuck in it because we don't know any different. There's also a lot of brain chemistry aspects that lead us to stay stuck in it, such as the oxytocin and dopamine release that takes place through sexual activity. There are other various components involved, but a big part of it is the programming of this is just what you know, so you stay in it.
And I would expect, is there something we should be developing with a little empathy to our partner as well? Because aren't they repeating patterns as
Yes.
well?
Yes, I actually love that you brought that up. That's a huge part of the work that I do in couples counseling. The first couple sessions are geared towards, we actually do a timeline of each partner. And so we go through their trauma history of full life, for starting at birth for one, and then I have the partner sit in on that so they can develop empathy around, oh my gosh, those things happened. Like that is where this is coming from, and then vice versa. And so you're absolutely right. We are all operating off our adaptive child. We all learn these behaviors to learn how to survive in childhood, and it's what we've carried with us. And so a lot of times when our partner is maybe being a little more dysfunctional or toxic, it's so easy to point the finger versus really sitting back and thinking, oh, wow, they must feel really scared right now. They must be really hurting right now, and really looking deeper of where it's coming from.
You say that, and by the way, I love that phrase, the adaptive child. I mean, that is something that, maybe we should write on our hands while we're going through relationship difficulties, because, and I love this exercise, and I want to explore it a little bit, because maybe it's something that clients could do, even just as an exercise if their relationship, or they're feeling, in order to build a little empathy for their partner, to sit down and sort of do that timeline. So do you have them do that? Tell me a little bit more about how you do that. Do you have the patient or the client explain what they know about the partner's past and history, or do you bring the partner in to do that?
So whoever's timeline we're doing, they're the main speaker of that session. Okay, so they're gonna talk about, I was born into this, and I ask the questions: when you were born, what do you know about the environment? Who was living there? What were their roles? What was their dynamic like? Because in utero, those stressors actually do influence what we then take with us into infancy and forward. And so I ask all those questions about what do you know? And then we talk about, some significant experiences, birth to 5, and then we just float forward. And so whoever's giving their timeline is the primary speaker. But what I will often do is kind of like pause them and ask the other partner, like, did you hear that? Did you catch that piece of that? What do you think that was like for them? Or how do you think that might influence them currently? And so I will then stop and pull the other partner in. And that just brings awareness around, okay, so when I go on a work trip and I'm gone for a week, yeah, that might be kind of triggering some abandonment for them. And so that's the whole purpose of it.
Yeah, well, and it was a therapist who said to me eons ago that awareness is the beginning of everything. Awareness
Yes.
is the start of healing, of understanding, of empathy, and really what you're doing. I wonder how many couples have actually explored that kind of emotional history of their spouse or their partner. Think about what a wonderful exercise that could be.
Right.
In bonding and understanding. It doesn't mean the relationship might, magically be healed,
Right.
but it's a wonderful exercise.
Sure. And often with the missing link that I notice, because I'll have partners who will say, oh yeah, I already knew that, or oh yeah, they've told me all that. But do you get it? Do you get the significance, and do you get the correlation to the present day behaviors? And so I think that is when we add that component in, they could certainly do it on their own, but they have to be willing to stop and really assess, like, okay, so how does this still influence them today? How do my behaviors trigger this for them today? So that when they become triggered, it's not so personalized. Like, okay, this doesn't make me a bad guy. This doesn't make me a bad partner. It means this is what I reminded them of. And so as long as that component is added in, then yes, I think it can be really beneficial to do either alone or in the therapeutic setting. But there has to be the willingness to assess, like, how is it still showing up today?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a important part, and something that, gosh, I have so many episodes on the need to look at your own side of the street and clean up your own side of the street. You mentioned that earlier, and there has to, in the same way that you can create empathy for your partner, or at least understanding of what they've been through, there has to be a benefit to going through the same exercise for yourself.
Right. Yes. And that because often it's actually easier to have empathy and grace for our partners than it is for ourselves, right? And so you're absolutely right. When they can tell their story in front of their partner and in front of a safe third party, and they can get validated. That's another big part of what I'm doing during that time is I'm role modeling validation and empathy, reflection, all of these things that I want them to learn for each other. I'm role modeling it for them, but also so that they can receive it for themselves. Because you're right, when they can see like, oh yeah, that actually was a big deal. That was traumatic. That can be really beneficial to have grace and empathy for yourself.
Yeah, well, and part of the healing process and even understanding it, I bet we often don't understand. Sorry, that was my dog.
That's okay.
So I would think when we're able to get that insight into, how our own past and history is affecting our today and the choices that we make and what triggers us, there has to be a great deal of help for us in moving forward, whether that be moving forward in the relationship, because this is a divorce podcast, or moving on beyond the relationship or after the relationship. So as it pertains to divorce, where for people right now who might be thinking, well, I've done this type of work, I realize this relationship isn't working for me. How does this relate into the divorce process?
Sure, because the behaviors that came up for us in our relationship are going to come up in our divorce. So the same concerns, the same areas of conflict, the same contentious dynamic is still going to exist. And so this is still valuable to understand your adaptive child, those behaviors, as well as your relational programming as you're going through divorce, because it brings awareness to like, okay, I'm being triggered because of this. And okay, normally I would behave in this way, but I've learned that's not really effective. So I'm going to choose to do it this way. So you can still, that awareness that you mentioned earlier, that's still key even during a breakup, especially if you hope to maybe have a breakup that can be healthier or that can be more amicable, which we know is just easier on the entire family dynamic when we can go that route.
Yeah, well, and I've talked many times about the level of conflict being a predictor for children having issues beyond the divorce, but also for us. I mean, a conflictual divorce process, for a process that's already difficult, high levels of conflict, trust me, folks, it is what makes a difficult experience truly horrible. And,
right.
And so having that awareness, one of the things that I see as a divorce attorney or as a mediator is spouses who understand how to push each other's buttons. And I would think that this would have to play into that relational programming. It's where you've picked up what triggers your partner and you start flipping that switch.
Right.
You're missing a step here, people. You're missing that empathy part.
Right. Right. And I guess checking in on and I have my clients ask themselves this all the time, what is the value in that? So whether it's that we're working on repairing their relationship, or that I work with a lot of clients as we go through the divorce process, whether they came to me because of that, or as we started doing this relationship work, believe it or not, they come in and we're like, okay, let's start working on this. And they recognize, I need to leave this relationship. I still believe that that's effective relationship work, because we were able to bring to their awareness, this isn't healthy, this isn't good for me, and I need to move on. And so as we're doing that, a question I have them challenge themselves with is, what is the value in this? So what is the value in this conversation? What is the value in sending that text message, sending that email, in setting that boundary, right? Because sometimes boundaries are set just as a form of control versus like, this is actually for my safety. And so that is something that I challenge people with all the time, to really just stop and check in. Like, what are going to be the likely outcomes if I do this? And is it actually beneficial or detrimental?
Yeah, that I call it the grace of space, or taking that pause. Don't
Yeah.
just fire off that text message. And I like your way of looking at it. What is the purpose in this? Why are you doing this? And often, during that difficult process of divorce, it's to flip a switch or push a button or trigger somebody. But
Right.
in the end, what is it what will that really achieve for you? So you yourself, I know, had a healthy divorce. And so one of the things how does this just play into, what do you tell your clients if you are working with people either as a couple or individually who are now going to navigate the divorce process? How do you help them use this information to have a healthy divorce?
Well, so I have them be aware of when their buttons are being pushed. So that's
Right.
that's a good awareness with your programming. Also being aware of what patterns we normally would engage in and choosing to do differently. And then a lot of this information we talk about with the relational programming when somebody's going through a divorce, it's because we're talking about what does the next relationship look like. So this one was not healthy. This one was rough on your mental health. How can we prevent that from happening? And so we will pull examples of what's going on during the divorce process of like, okay, did you catch that? Did you catch their motivation behind doing that? And did you catch how you responded differently than you maybe would have before the work that we've been doing? And so, I mean, we do pull it into navigating, going through it with their ex, but then also what does that look like as they're looking for their future relationship?
That's so important, because first of all, you must hear this, because I hear this as people are going through divorce. I am never getting married or getting into another relationship again. But folks, guess what? We are somewhat hardwired for companionship and finding a mate. You likely will. And it strikes me that I think one of the really important nuggets of this is that although you may have been relationally programmed, you have the ability to rewire that computer or reprogram that computer, as you were saying. And you can start that during the process of the divorce itself.
Yes, and it's an ideal time to start it because emotions are heightened. These things are going on that aren't just going to happen at any other time of your life. This really gives you a good framework to check on, okay, how am I reacting to this? How can I do this differently? And so, yeah, that's a great time to do it. And that's the exact reason I use the computer as the analogy, is because in the same way that it was originally programmed that way with plugging in wires and putting in parts, we can then change the wires and parts, and then the computer can then function differently. And so that's the same for us. As you mentioned earlier, when we have an awareness around this is our tendency, this is where it came from, we then get to choose to do different. So we then get to take a step back and say, okay, I would normally respond this way. It hasn't been effective. I'm going to try this way this time. And that's all part of the reprogramming. And it's hard and it's tedious and time consuming and does not happen overnight. I tell my clients, I tell interviews, like, I am still a work in progress, both as well. I know all this information. I identify as a relationship expert, and I still regularly come up against my own relational programming, my own triggers, my own negative core beliefs that really tempt me to behave in a certain way. And there has to be a conscious decision not to, which, by the way, I'm not always great at, but I am trying.
I know that feeling. I have to. So you mentioned that the divorce is the best time because things will come up, and I'm thinking of divorce as like the petri dish of, fixing your relational programming. And you're right? It is, you're under pressure in this moment in a relationship. And so all the things that you probably need to work on are getting brought to the surface here.
Completely.
So it makes such perfect sense. So one more reason, folks, to have, some mental health help, get a therapist as you're going through divorce. I have told people for years that even if you are not someone who believes in therapy or thinks that you need therapy, get a therapist while you are going through divorce. There is so much that you can benefit. And I mentioned earlier, and you mentioned you've used or not struggle, but relationships are challenging. You yourself had a healthy divorce.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit. Usually I ask my guests at the beginning of an episode for their backstory, but here we kind of, have built to that. But I think, what would you say about a healthy divorce from the inside view?
Sure. Yes. So my ex-husband is my present day best friend. Like we get along well. He was really, and is really, my support system. And what's interesting is that when relational programming takes place, we can sometimes seek out the exact opposite of that, right? So we can, especially if our relational programming was not safe, it was chaotic, it was not emotionally attentive, we might try to seek out the opposite. So our behaviors are going to remain the same because that's how we were programmed, but we might want to search for this safe place. So he was my safe place for a very, very long time. And I know that that's a big part of why we were able to go through a healthy divorce, but it was also a very conscious effort and very conscious decision so we have a son together, and we didn't want to rock his world any more than it was already going to be, like, inevitably from a divorce. And so we made this decision. We had a lot of open, vulnerable conversations, but I'm not going to lie, we also had a lot of really painful tears on the bathroom floor conversations, right? He was such a huge part of my life for over half of my life. And so the thought of losing him, not only as a husband, just as somebody in my life, I mean, was all very painful and overwhelming. And so we were able to figure it out, though. And I would say that my biggest takeaway is that we took it day by day. And so the whole transition process from, me finding somewhere to live, that was emotional and painful. And then my son, the first few weeks of him and going back and forth, that was painful. When we both started dating again, so there were multiple really key aspects or pivotal moments that took place that we had to choose to, okay, we're going to work through this in this moment, because if we bring everything else in, it becomes too overwhelming. But if we focus on the present moment and the concern at hand, we were able to navigate through that a lot more effectively.
Yeah, you described that so beautifully, poignantly, but beautifully.
Thank you.
I thank you for sharing it, because I think, I've been through my own divorce, and I work with people daily who are going through this process. And one of the things that people always say is that the future is so scary because it's this huge unknown, and you're going through this difficult time. You want to get there, but you've got to go through this. And I love that tip of just, deal with what is in the moment. It's almost like AA, right? Where they say one day at a time, or one step at a time, or I think they even say 1 minute at a time, right? Don't pick up a drink in the next minute. Don't, just deal with each and every moment. And you also mentioned the word vulnerable, that you went through a divorce, and at times you and your former spouse, were vulnerable with each other in a time when most people put up the hardest shell they can possibly pull around themselves.
Yes. Yeah, no, that is a great point, that, we allowed each other to see the raw parts even through the divorce. And I don't want to at all, and I try to put the disclaimer that we obviously have a unique relationship, and everybody has their own unique relationship. And so to assert that it was a simple process, or that anyone can easily do this, I understand that's not the case. I understand that there are really unhealthy, really toxic, really abusive people out there. And so I do want to put that disclaimer that by no means allow your boundaries to, don't let your boundaries be violated. Don't be a doormat in order to do this. But I also really tell people that you guys loved each other at one point for a reason. You loved and respected each other. You thought really highly of each other at one point. And so there's no reason why you can't continue to do that. What the switch in the perspective has to be is we're just in a different season now. And so I still respect you as a human, and I still think you are a great person. but now we got to figure out how to do this in this season of life, which is vastly different. But you can carry those feelings of love and respect into the breakup as well.
Such a wonderful way to look at it. You know, the relationship does not become all bad just because it's no longer the right relationship for one or both of you. And I have always said, if it's not the right relationship for one of you, it's not the right relationship for both of you. But I know that's hard for a lot of people. This is just, I mean, this has been wonderful. I think there's so many nuggets in this conversation for people to take away. And I thank you for sharing your experience, because I also think that it's very helpful. One of the things I hear from my listeners over and over again is that they love the nuggets, they love the tips, they love the insights, but what they really truly need at a lot of the time is just to see and hear from someone that made it through and are in there beyond, and know that they can get there and that everything's going to be okay. So thank you so much for joining me today, sharing all of these insights and the relational programming and deprogramming that we can do. What's the best way? Let everybody know how they can find you, reach out to you, and where they can find the Calm, Cool, and Connected podcast.
Sure. So my website is evolvecounselingaz.com. I can also be found on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. And then Calm, Cool, and Connected, we air through Cox Communications. And so in some regions we air as a talk show, and then otherwise we can be found on all major podcast platforms.
I was just listening today, so go listen, everyone. I will put all of the links, as always, in the show notes. And Dr. Liz, thank you really, truly so much. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know it's going to be both helpful and hopeful for my listeners. Thank you.
Thank you so much.